I must say, I was hoping that I wouldn't be the guy who's keeping the audience away from dinner and cocktails, but I guess I am. So I'm sorry for that. And I'll try and keep this to the time limit that we've been assigned. But as you have seen during the day, architects are not known to keep to their time limits. But I have 20 slides, so at least I will limit myself to that. Okay, so my talk today is called Closer Apart. In a sense, it's kind of got to do with the journey my partner Vaibhav and I have had in setting up the practice over the past 20 years. So it was a 20 slide presentation, 20 seconds per slide. We've finished 20 years recently. And so the idea was to share with you what has happened in the past 20 years and what we think is going to happen in the next 20 years. So it's called Closer Apart, Building Disaggregations. So that's us. We met in the late mid 90s, I guess you say. By the turn of the millennium, by 2000, we had decided we wanted to start a firm. And so this is a journey of the two of us in the past 20 years. I have to say, it's been so fulfilling that I think it feels like it's been like 40 years of stuff that we've done in the past 20 years, been jam-packed. So I'm really grateful for having a great partner in Vaibhav, who's come along for this journey with me. So when we met in the mid 90s, the 90s seems like a really long time back. And the thing was, in the 90s, when we joined college, it appeared that the world promised many things. So in the 90s was when the European Union was formed, USSR had broken up, there was this Commonwealth of states, independent states, of which both Ukraine and Russia were members. There was the good old SARC. I don't know how many of you remember the South Asian alliance that we had, but there was the sense that governments and nations were allying and they were doing it in this sort of to propagate a sense of cooperation, albeit economic cooperation seemed to be the main thing, but cooperation nonetheless. Definitely our own minds were opening up to increased information. 90s in India was all about the growth of cable TV. It was about the spread of internet. And it was cell phones. And at that time, it didn't appear that cell phones would become so majorly part of our lives, but it was definitely an idea that we would be informing ourselves much more. And of course, there was growing multilateralism, meaning that there was a sort of sense that all of us as humanity on this planet can do certain things together out of goodness. That is like protect our environment, explore space, write software that is open source. These were all things we promised ourselves in the 90s. But today, quite clearly, that dream seems to have changed a little bit. We are post-globalized, we are hyper-connected, and we are climate changed. I think we've all speak about sustainability. It's interesting to note that the COP21, where that 2-degree limit was set to global warming, if you read the convention that was produced at the end of that long negotiation, it actually stopped talking about sustainability. We are now talking about resilience. So that basically means that climate change has happened. There is only going to be more and more apocalyptic climatic events that we now have to start bracing for. And you can see evidence of this. So, Russia has attacked Ukraine and all that's happened. But essentially what seems to me is that diplomacy has taken nowadays seems to have gone very cynical. It's almost like nations and governments are behaving like mafia, like their own little business, their own self-interest, their own ways of doing things. And it kind of emphasizes these three types of nationalism that you see widespread across the world: cultural nationalism, economic nationalism, maritime national. So the thing that we can't even live on, like the ocean, is now being chopped up into territorialities of various kinds, and ultimately resource nationalism. So whether it's oil and gas in Russia, whether it is thorium from Kerala, there are various resources that are now being territorialized by human beings based on nations. Hyper-connected means we are in connected cocoons. I don't need to explain this. We are all experiencing this. Whether it's gated living, gated communities like the complex that is around us over here, where public spaces are actually better described as bubble-ic spaces, in the sense you create these protected bubbles and call them public, but they're not really public. Free trade zones, which don't have any economic laws applying on them. Data localization, where we are fighting to ensure that our data that is produced in India by Indians stays in India and doesn't get kept in Ireland and outside Indian jurisdiction. And of course, online groups and WhatsApp groups we are all familiar with. Climate change is evidence in severe ecological breakdown, and I think that's, joke apart, that is the most serious concern that architects and designers should be thinking about, is the sheer breakdown of ecology, which is we're pulling things out of the ground, there's geospheric depletion, we're burning it and pushing it up into the atmosphere, so there's atmospheric pollution. I come from Delhi, which is now won the 5th year, I think, for the world's most polluted city. So that's us, right on top. Hydrospheric mayhem. So because of all this pollution and the mayhem it causes, poor Chennai gets an annual flood that, that is, it's like from hell. And of course, a gradual loss of biodiversity. So we have now become the species that is responsible for removing all other species from this planet. So how has architecture changed in the past 20 years? So when we joined architecture school, it was a time of Venturi, Zaha Hadid, Gehry were around the corner. And by the time we graduated, there were hip, young, cool, rock star architects like Bjarke Ingels on the prowl. Architecture wanted to be global, it wanted to be high tech, and it wanted to be cool, but cool in a green sort of way. And unfortunately, when we stand today in 2020, post-2020, it appears that architecture has become essentially only urban. There's no context of architecture that is not urban. It's always top-down. There are big ideas that are expected to have trickle-down effects, and it is invariably aspiring to be iconic. So buildings aren't celebrated unless they look radically different from other buildings. And that's a very strange sort of aspiration for architects to set themselves. But actually, as has been apparent during the lockdown, it's been apparent during various forms of climatic events, droughts, floods, urbanization across the world is not really a happy thing. It's actually deruralization by exodus. People are being forced out of rural conditions into urban conditions. And you see that in these 3 types of refugees that are now well known to all of us. There are ethnic refugees who are fleeing ethnic wars. There are climatic refugees like Syrians and people in the Middle East. And there are livelihood refugees that we call urban migrants in this country. But they are actually livelihood refugees. So that's what urbanization is. This is a very famous photograph of the city lights of the world by NASA. So you zoom into India and you consider what India has specifically been going through in the past 20 years. So what's India 2020? And it's interesting, like other forms of urbanizations are dots of light. In India, it seems to be a sort of spread, a kind of amorphous blur of lights. So let's go back, let's dial back to 2000. And 2000 we became 1 billion strong population and people spoke about demographic dividend and how we would somehow be this pulsating economic engine to the world economy. Well, today we've added 40% more. You notice there's barely any increase in our contribution to world population. And actually by 2040, we would have added 50% more in the by 2040, but our contribution to world population is actually going to be dropping by a percentage. Not too much variation, but it's interesting to understand that we are no longer, population and growing population is not going to be such a big concern anymore. It's actually going to be more about what do we do about people who are old. So far the story has always been about young India and so on and so forth. Next 20 years possibly is going to be about how old age is handled in India. So I call it blurbinism. It's not urban, it's a blur between rural and urban. And this is the story. This is from the Niti Aayog projections. Oh, sorry, so I haven't stuck to the time. So the interesting thing to note here is that the biggest growth in urban India is not happening in big cities. It's not been happening in big cities. It's not going to happen in big cities. It's actually going to happen in settlements that you can best call almost cities. These are populations of 10 lakhs and less. So they are very large villages or very small towns. That is where architecture needs to be locating itself and practicing, not in big cities. there are two phenomena for blurbinism that I have identified. One is called what I call the frothing fringe, which is this kind of completely high-speed development of an unregulated outer edge of a city, a peri-urban fringe to the city. And simultaneously, as the city expands, it grows around rural settlements and they get kettled. So there's a lot of pressure on those rural settlements, and invariably they become urban slums, or they house the urban livelihood refugees or the refugees who come into cities. So these are two phenomena that I think from an urban perspective architects will need to deal with. And there are two fallouts of the previous ways of thinking about cities and looking at cities as being the opposite of villages no longer apply. So there are two evidences for this. One is how slowly our master plans respond to how quickly our cities change. So there is a certain laggardliness to our master plans, and what that ends up being is that majority, like 70%, 80% of our cities are actually extra legal. I don't like to call them illegal, because illegal means it's breaking the law. Extra legal means the law doesn't exist to cover that kind of development. And unfortunately, even projects that are undertaken by the government, including the Central Vista project, often rely on sidestepping development control regulations in order to achieve their goals. And of course, this is something at the bottom that all of us are familiar with, the kind of eco-catastrophes that are happening at the edges of city, at that fringe. So what are the lessons we have to learn? Just give me. So what are the prospects for the next 20 years? Disaggregating architecture. This is what I'm proposing is perhaps something we need to think about. I think even Manish's points on architecture were going in that direction. One is we'll be constantly building at borders. So that means our architecture needs to negotiate territorialities or perceptions of ownership and perceptions of privacy. The second is we need to start designing for disassembly, for pulling apart, because architecture is going to be a lot less stable, a lot less permanent. We have to think of materiality as being something which engages with impermanence. So these are two examples of a pavilion in Kochi and a design of a stall in exhibition in Delhi where we used foam. Architecture is not about constructing space anymore. It's also about doing some bottom-up tooling. So from the base of society, base of pyramid, how do we tool or create a set of tools that can actually diversify both information and sanitation? These are two key aspects of what we're going to be facing as challenges in the next 20 years. The other thing is we take architecture very seriously because we spend at least 5 years studying it. But actually building technology needs to be actually distributed and disaggregated and spread. So these are two examples. One where in a village outside called Durgapur in Bihar, we've innovated on trying to build some compressive masonry units out of waste plastic that is gathered from Bodh Gaya, which is a tourist center. And the second is to be able to teach Pahalwans in Western UP how to build with rammed earth, so that when they want to set up their own akhadas, they have the toolkit to do it themselves. They're not reliant on any other external agency. We always talk about all these stalls are selling us new material. I think it's about time we start understanding that material has lives and afterlives, and therefore a lot of architectural material innovation is going to rely on scavenging and foraging for material to create new material because of a change in how we look at waste. And the other thing that is now more apparent is that we cannot imagine architecture is only meant for human beings. As architects, we need to start designing for the non-human. Now this is plant, animal, and more artificial intelligence. I think all these three spheres are going to really explode in the next 20 years. And so to finally end, what are we building for? We should be building not for buildings, we should be building for streets and neighborhoods. We should be building for multi-vocalities, like our designs have to say different things to different people, or various people should be able to interpret our designs in different ways. It's not just one message that our designs need to give out. We need to construct to diffuse supplies but scatter reservoirs, so that we create more permanent protective layers that are more permanently situated. And we need to make with technologies that consider material afterlives and consider self-builds, not specialist construction. So I'll stop there. That's the four of us now who lead Anagram. Thank you.